Welcome to the Indigenous Language Institute's Web Symposium series. I'm Mara Studi, ILA board member and your moderator. Today's presentation featuring Rosa Francour will last approximately 1 hour. After the presentation, we will take a 10-minute break before starting the session. During the break, keep this window open. Do not leave the webinar. You cannot be readmitted. To submit a question, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session after the break. And now, may I present Rosa Francour.
Spagweg, Yegon Sio ni Jojelatu, Igele Dokanigoanage, Ne Gini Wagatanuni, Jiganto Ige Senua, Kale Migele G. Dai guanuhela du na ua, nene watnis leo na ua, nguahloli, ji ugly wage na u, keli hunyani he, jit idwa wanoda se, kale jini guali hoda se unguhoid neha, keli hunyani he, ladiksa suha, ne ganjo guagu ne de hadi wanakwa, nene, Ungwajina jitni ungwajina koda ungohoit neha ne dehadi wanakwa ni ganjo koda. So hello everyone. I am Yegon Si. That's my Oneida name. I'm Oneida from Wisconsin. I'm Turtle Clan, and I'm an instructor in the Behadi Wanakwa Language Nest Immersion Program in our community here. And I'm so happy to be here today to share some of my experiences, some teaching tools, share a little bit about our programming and our language efforts in the Oneida community here in Wisconsin, as well as just hearing questions from you, answering things. And I do have a presentation, so I will share that. So I will share my screen and kind of go through that here. So let me find that. And let me know if you can see it. All right, hopefully this is working. Is this visible? Okay, so I'll get started. So kind of what I wanted to talk about today or share today was some of the programming efforts we have in the community here where I'm from in Oneida, Wisconsin, some of my own teaching and learning experiences, and some immersion teaching techniques, and a few other things. So one of my personal beliefs is that our Indigenous languages is a medicine. So that's kind of like the overarching thought. It's the why for why I do this work. And so I just wanted to share a few things about, I guess, our community in relation to that. So the two logos you have, or you see on the screen, the one on the left is the program that I work for. It's Dehadiwanak, and I'll show that shortly. It means they pick up the word. So that's the name of our language nest, which is now soon to be a program, slowly growing into a school. And then the other one, sorry, that was the one on the right. The one on the left, it says Oneida de Agan Jitni Dwawanoa. That is our Oneida language department. So the program that I work for, the Dehadiwanakwa Language Nest, is a program out of the Oneida Language Department, and that department is actually out of the Oneida Nation school system here in my community. So it's kind of like a multi-partnership type of program or effort. So I'll share a little bit about that. So I just had some kind of guiding things as to how I'm going to share some of this today. And I'll talk a little bit more about myself shortly, just introduce myself a little bit more, some of my personal motivations, history, background, some of the current Oneida language programming efforts, including the efforts of our Oneida language department and the immersion program that I work for, just some of our challenges, some brief immersion teaching tools and techniques. And then just lastly, just the importance of this work and remembering your why. So those are some of the things I'll share with you today. So I'll get started first. So I'm, as I mentioned, from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I've been a learner of Unguho'etne, which is the Oneida language, for about 11 years. So I'm an adult learner. I haven't learned as a young child or since I was young. I actually picked it up in adulthood after I graduated college. So I'll share a little bit about why I did that shortly, but I've been a teacher of Oneida language for about 10 years now, so I don't know where the time is going. It just goes by fast now. So, but I've taught in both second language acquisition environments. I've taught in a local public school here, and then I've kind of recently, I guess in the last 3-4 years, transitioned into teaching in an immersion environment. So I've had some experience teaching in both second language and immersion environments. I've taught at one of our local community colleges as well to adult second language learners. And I teach parent classes as part of our immersion program as well. So I did have some experience in both second language acquisition and immersion. I'm currently working and finishing my EDD doctorate at the University of Green Bay. So I got about 6-7 more months. So knock on wood. So, but so part of my studies with that is continuing and researching Indigenous education, Indigenous immersion education, Oneida language revitalization, Oneida language teaching, learning and teaching experiences. So that's kind of a lot of some of the background of, I guess, other areas of my work, I suppose you could say. So in the Dehadi Manakwa Language Nest, I am a head immersion instructor. So I do lead instruction in the youngest classroom that we have, which serves ages 3 to 4. And I work with a co-lead. Her name is Yujiglugewas House. We've worked together for a couple years now. We've known each other for a long time. And we have multi-age level classrooms with our program. And we have 2 instructors in each classroom. We have a lead and a co-lead. The lead has higher proficiency and does most of the speaking. And then the co-lead is the support for that. So that's kind of my job. As a head instructor, I also train all the other instructors. So that's kind of new to my role this year. Our program was fortunate enough to get some additional ANA Esther Martinez immersion funding this year. So we were able to hire new staff, start to expand our program. And so that was kind of a new responsibility I had this year, was training staff in language, teaching pedagogy, teaching skills, instruction, and then preparing them for an immersion setting. So that is a little bit about me. There's a lot more I could share, but I think that's pretty, in essence, that's a lot, I guess, that I would share today. So just a little bit more about some of the why and what brought me to, I guess, this work is, it's been, I guess, 11 years now since I've been learning. And I started learning about right after college. And I really wanted to learn about who I was and where I came from, just understand my own identity. Who am I as an Oneida person? Who am I as an Oneida woman? What does that mean? What are my responsibilities as that? And so I think just in the development of my own life, I just started asking some questions about where I came from and who I was. And I was born and raised on the reservation. I didn't have any experience in learning Oneida as I was young, besides some basic words that we kind of used regularly in our community, but I didn't have an understanding or a comprehension of it. And so as I got older, I started to wonder more about that and where it came from. So that was kind of some of the, I guess that was the catalyst for me wanting to learn. So once I started learning, one of my really good friends, Lutta Glogwet Danforth, he works for the language department, and I knew that he worked there, and I just asked him, I said, you teach language? I want to attend a class. So we just did a one-on-one class, and I still keep that up to this day. So part of teaching in general is learning. So I have language learning and training that I do regularly still with him. But he's one of the main people that helped me learn Oneida. And so that was something that that's kind of, I guess, how it started for me in the beginning. So as I was kind of like a new learner, I started learning just about the characteristics and the patterns of Ungohoete and our language. And I realized how, I guess, important understanding those finite things of our language were to really the larger picture of what our language is, and just developing a comprehension and an understanding about what Oneida language is as opposed to memorization of it. So that it started like opening my eyes, I guess, when I was studying. I realized there's lots of patterns within our language, and we can manipulate them and conjugate things differently based on I guess, a predictable pattern. So that really helped open my eyes in my initial stages of my learning journey. And even through that time as a young person, just a young adult, learning about who I was and where I came from, a lot of what I learned, just maybe the process of it, really helped me realize how powerful our original words are, and that our language really does have a spirit. It's a living entity. And one of our jobs as Indigenous people is to take care of that, to foster that spirit, and that it's going to take care of us. So it's a reciprocal relationship, most definitely, with our language. We take care of it, and it will take care of us. And that when it takes care of us, it's really that medicine. I know just learning language in general, for me personally, it's been a medicine, and has helped me through some challenging parts of my life, and it still does to this day. So that's what I always say. That's one of my biggest motivating factors and why I teach really is because I know that our language is a medicine, and I have a responsibility and desire to share that with other people so that they can feel that too. Because I know and definitely not just in my community, but a lot of Indigenous communities, we have so many social issues that affect our community, is that if we focus on some proactive approaches with language and cultural revitalization, that can really address a lot of those things that affect our communities. So it's something I'm really passionate about, and it's always exciting just being able to share this with other people. So, but just one other thing I just wanted to share about this idea of reciprocity with our language. And I know this isn't just my community, but definitely a lot of communities across Turtle Island, that, our languages are in a state of emergency, and that we haven't really, on our end, been feeding or taking care of our responsibilities to that language. And so we're seeing, the decline of our languages, but, if we start feeding that again, that we can really bring that back, and it can help us too. So I have a positive outlook that I try to keep about, the future of our language, and that the possibilities really are endless. And that's just an important part of the work, I would say too, that it's in our cultural ways, we say Gatniguhli is it's like the practice of a good mind. And so that's something that we really, at least for us here, our learners in our community, we hold that close, because that is a part of the language learning process and the journey and the teaching journey as well, to share that with others and practice that every single day. So that's kind of just part of my personal practice. But I guess for me too, it's a personal responsibility of mine to share what I've learned with others. I know one thing is that I really want to help positively impact speakership in my community, re-normalize our language again in our community, create speakers through our immersion programming, and strengthen our tribal sovereignty. So the way, just reclaiming, I guess, our power and using that in the current contemporary time period, I suppose you could say, especially with, I guess, in regards to education, educating our children in our community the way that we would have, prior to white stream education, prior to colonization, and just really reclaiming and doing that. So that's part of kind of how I see it, as well as revitalizing our language to strengthen our sovereignty as well. So I kind of touched on this a little bit, but influencing, one of the other things is I guess some of my work is influencing education to be inclusive to Indigenous immersion education and the use of cultural curriculums in education as a valid and equitable form of education. So I guess currently the education is starting to become more inclusive, but it definitely still has a ways to go. So just work as a language instructor is definitely a form of activism. So that is, I guess, part of my job, part of what I do. And so as an educator and a head instructor in our program, that's something that I'm always striving to influence, including the policies that are in the state of Wisconsin for us here, but as well as federally. So that's really important to me, to make sure that our ways or our traditional forms of education are respected and seen as valid and equitable in the larger society. So that's kind of sometimes a struggle for us, I guess you could say. But I'll kind of move on. Just, I wanted to share some background about my community a little bit more, the program in which I work with, where I come from, and it kind of fits with some of the work and my personal motivations to what I've done thus far. So our language, I'm from Oneida. We have 3 communities actually across the United States and Canada. So my people are originally from out east in New York. And so there's still a community there in Oneida. We also have one in Canada, and then our largest community is here in Wisconsin. So we've been relocated here due to federal policies, federal relocation policies. So just that alone, that, I guess, that part of our history, that really impacted our language, not for the good. We are so far removed, I guess you could say, from our original homelands that it's made it it's more barriers and struggles to reclaim our language, because we don't sit on our traditional homelands, although this is our home now. And we have treaties with the state of Wisconsin and the United States that acknowledges this area as our reservation. But historically, our original territory is in out east, eastern United States, in New York. So, but that's kind of part of the background as to where our language is right now, why it is. We are classified as critically endangered, and we only have very few functional speakers in our community right now. We have one first language speaker and we have a fluent second language speaker. We have a population of around 17,000. So it's about like 0.0001% of our community that is a fluent speaker. We do have a number of proficient speakers in our language, in our community. And so that's kind of the state of where our language is at. We do have very, very few speakers, but one of the other parts about where our language is at is we have a lot of documentation. We actually have 2 published dictionaries. We have a variety of documented curriculum language resources. So that's kind of what we've used here to really revitalize our language and try to bring it back up to where we would like it to be, creating new speakers, both first and second language speakers here. So that's a little bit about my community, the state of the language here. So just one thing is what that means for us now is we have a responsibility and play a role. We all have a responsibility in playing a role in revitalizing and reclaiming the Oneida language. So for us, it's like a collective responsibility. We have differing roles. Some are teachers, some are learners, some are students, some are support, some help with funding, some are policy, administrative. So that whole thing together, that's like the collective, the community responsibility. So that's one thing I would share too, is if you're working in, in your own community with language, everyone has a different role, and that's okay. That all of that together is what pushes and helps your language, your programming efforts grow. So as I mentioned, my program, the Dehediwanakwa Language Nest Immersion Program, it's an immersion initiative that's run through the Oneida Language Department. They're kind of like the overarching organizational program for the Language Nest. And then the language department is situated within the Oneida Nation school system. So that is a BIE tribally run school. And so that's kind of where we fit, I guess, within our community structurally. So the Oneida Language Department, the goal for that program is to increase the number of Oneida language speakers in the Oneida Nation. The current programming focus areas for that department is Oneida language immersion programming, which is the area that I work within. They also provide support and instruction for the Oneida Nation school system. They do also provide instruction for surrounding public schools. They do community language programming, and they offer classes with different groups of people in the community. They also develop curriculum and do other multimedia design, language support materials and things like that. And so just a few more things about that. We have a number of language and cultural efforts taking place in our community. And this slide here, the main thing that we I guess why we share this is because probably a lot of other communities, I would say, have like a variety of language and culture programming efforts, and all of that is needed. All of that's really important because that's what makes the collective. Different programs have, they address different needs, they address different audiences, they can help different, I guess, participants or populations of your community, but all of that together is what helps really support your language efforts, help grow those language efforts in the community. So I always think about it as kind of like a spectrum, or maybe like a puzzle. Like we need all the pieces to have the picture of, I guess, the language landscape in our community. That's kind of how I would say it. So what the parts that I work within is it's a small effort in our community, but we have so many other ones, and that all of those are important. All of those are needed. I know that within our community here, sometimes there is maybe a misconception that we should only be doing one or two of these things, but we really need all of these things because it's the efforts of all of these different areas that are going to help us really grow our language. So that's kind of the main reason of showing you a variety of the programming efforts in our community, that they're all important and they're all needed. So I'll kind of go into my program in a little bit, just talking about Indigenous language immersion, but I just wanted to show a few things here about some of our programming that we have in our community. So we have second language acquisition, cultural acquisition with language, partial immersion programming efforts, and then full immersion programming efforts. So we just have a variety of initiatives and programming that fall within all of these, and that this whole circle, all of them together, is what our community is doing in terms of revitalizing Oneida language and culture. So one thing that we do here that's very new, I guess, for our community is administering full immersion instruction and education. So that just means if you're familiar or maybe not as familiar with it, there's definitely levels to immersion, dual language immersion, partial immersion. There's lots of terminology, I guess, that's used with what that is. So in the program that I have, the Language Nest, that's a full immersion program. So it's 100% in Unghohne. There's no English in our program that we use, that the instructors use. And so the instructional medium is Oneida. We teach all content through the language. That is the program that I work for. The language department, which is what OLD is, that's the acronym. They do some adult immersion with that supports that as well. But for what we do here, just kind of a little background about, I guess, how we see immersion for our community is it's culturally centered and holistic educational programming that uses the target language. So for us, that's our language, the Oneida language, as the sole medium of instruction. It means that we teach all content in a culturally centered way through the use of Oneida only with no English. So when in our spaces, we always consider like our classrooms or our programming like sacred spaces. So it really helps to foster that use of our language in those sacred spaces, and that we don't have many of those in our community. So if we treat those designated areas as sacred spaces where our language lives, then we can continue to support our immersion efforts. So I just added a few other things too about benefits of immersion. Part of my work as a doctoral student at the University of Green Bay is doing research on this. It's kind of my focus area, so work and school is all, I guess, mixed for me, but it helps too because sometimes there really is, I guess, misconceptions on what immersion is, what the benefits of immersion are, Indigenous language immersion. We as a society sometimes we have been conditioned to white stream education. And I'm very intentional about saying it that way because that is the curriculum that mainstream education focuses on is white ideology. And so we know that that has not been serving our students well, our Indigenous students, but really even beyond that, all students of all backgrounds. And so I guess we're probably at a point right now, it seems that we're taking a look like, why is this not working? Why are these white stream schools, public schools, not working for our kids? And so, but at the same time, we seem to, or I guess tend to get caught up in still going along with it, I guess you could say, and being maybe shy or not sure about, well, what does our Indigenous forms of education look like? How do we reclaim that? What does that mean for me, or what does that mean for my child if they might be in an immersion program? And so sometimes you'll hear misconceptions like they're going to be behind, or their English language development. What is that going to be like? They're academically behind. And so those are kind of some of the misconceptions, but I always think it's really important to share some of the benefits because really all the research says that immersion is a highly beneficial educational form for students, not just Indigenous students, but really all students. Multilingualism is beneficial in every aspect. So just a few things I'll share. Language immersion positively impacts educational achievement. Learning more than one language enhances cognitive development, social growth. It promotes understanding among diverse people and cultures. Early childhood immersion in First Nations languages have been linked to higher income, better health, greater social and civic engagement, lifelong access to learning, and less involvement with the justice system. And immersion programs report that 90% of students graduating and going on to post-secondary education compared to the average of 60. There's improved retention rates, and and better cognitive results across a range of topics. So that's just looking at what immersion is and some of the research, what it suggests about Indigenous language immersion. But within our own programs, and if you work in just language education in general in your community or immersion education in your community, you know that there's a lot more benefits to that. Really, language immersion tangibly is the use of the language, increasing language speakership, but what it really does is it harnesses and revitalizes the world view, how we see the world as Indigenous people. So that is one of the main, I would say, benefits. What I've seen among my students is increased problem-solving skills, that notion of having exposure to more than one language at a young age. You can see their brains, them just physically, the way that their eyes work, the way that their engagement is, accessing different parts of the brain, using problem-solving skills to develop comprehension in their traditional language in an immersion setting. So that is, I guess, one skill it's just so important, because I guess for me and some of the work that I've done, I feel that it's what Indigenous intellect is. It's being very critical, reflective, and open about the possibilities of the development and the interworkings of our cultures. So that's one like beautiful thing, I guess, about what immersion can do, is really just expand your mind to new levels beyond maybe this fixed mindset that kind of is promoted in society. So I just wanted to share a few of those things. So I'll talk a little bit more about my program. Dehadi Wanakwa, it means they pick up the word. We were formerly known, we're in the middle of kind of a rebranding, I guess you could say. We're known as a language nest, but we're now an immersion program. Next year, we are adding another classroom. It's a K1 multi-level classroom, and we're starting to begin our expansion process. So it's going to take about 10 years for us, because we'll add classrooms every other year, multi-age classrooms. As our oldest group of students get older and enter a new grade, we will add a new classroom, a higher level classroom for them, up until our students are age 18. So right now, our expansion plan really focuses on pre-K to about age 18, but we're hoping as well in the next few years to address birth to 3, as well as adult immersion and 18 plus. So we have kind of, I guess you could say, a lot going on, but I suppose it's the natural development of language revitalization in a community. So I have some pictures of my students, because that is the why. This is why we do everything, why we do it. So they're wearing little shirts that says "Ungwe Hawai Ni'i." It means I'm Oneida. So that is just a really good part I like to add in here. I could talk about the program all day, but really it's the kids, and just with the virtual format, it just helps to, I guess, bring a different level of engagement and what our program is about to a presentation like this. So our program mission for our Dehadi Wanakwa Language Nest, we want to reestablish an Oneida language speaking community by actively growing new speakers through language immersion instruction and education, with the intent of normalizing the use of Oneida language within our territory, to restore community wellness and the resurgence of our cultural practices and traditions founded on the practice of peace, strength, and a good mind. And those 3 aspects, peace, strength, and a good mind, those are core aspects of our culture. Skana, Gatsasnaslan, Gatni Gohli, those are really central aspects to one of the more, I guess, pivotal stories of our people, the Gayan Laslat Goa, the Great Law. It's one of the stories of how all the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy came together. And that story is the basis for the establishment of the United States federal government. And so there's a lot to it, but it really is the just central cultural values for our people. And so we want to harness that through the use of our language. That's essentially what our program mission is. So I hope that this video works. Let me know if it is not, because there is some sound in here. But I did just want to share a video about just a real short immersion lesson. I think it's a minute or two of our kids in action. So the two boys in here, this was prior to the pandemic. I think it was just prior to March, what was it, 2020? I'm losing track of the years now, but these two they were in our program. They were second year students. And so this is a little lesson about animals and some characteristics about where they live and a few other things. So it's just kind of cool because I'll share shortly about like immersion teaching techniques. And so you can kind of see like how that all comes together. And it's just a real short snippet of 2 minutes of our entire day, but it's just good because this is like our why. This is why we do what we do. So I'll start it and just let me know if the sound is not working. I can try to see if I can fix that. Okay, children, want to what do you want to do? Say what do you want to do? Nati Nati wade. Okay, got to me see going down. Okay, children, want to Nati let's go. Nati school. Right? Balale. Nati wade. Nati wade double. Nati wade ribbit red. Nati wade dogas. Oh, spelling guns. Nati quiet. Yewa ita. Nati kai. Gusto good. Kasi nati kai. Gusto. Nati kai. Let's try to stay right. No? Kada gahago? Kashi. Okay. That's a really good idea. I don't know why my sister and brother's basket. Not to quiet. When is your basket come? Really gonna need to go on. Not to okay, you can what? Good. That's really good. Okay, I was saying that even that's a new legal John who's follow. Happy quiet. Let's go. If I can wait again. Please support. Let's see if we can call the phone. That's a lahan o. That's a new legal na that's really that's so weird. Say goes to all right, so that was just a real short little clip of just a brief lesson. I just did a little activity with the boys during playtime, actually. So it's something we were working on. It was kind of a rolling lesson we had in our program. And it's helpful sometimes. We do recordings here and there, and the staff will watch them back, and we use them as learning tools for ourselves, just to develop our own teaching skills and language development. But it's helpful because then I can share these moments too in these spaces as well, so that you can see what our program is like. That's one of the things all the time. I know sometimes I'll attend presentations, and it's the students, you want to see what's going on. And so this is a little bit about what we do, and you can kind of see it in action. So let me see if I can get to the next slide. Okay, so just a little bit more about the logistics of our program. So we actually just ended our third year. We will be starting our fourth year in the fall. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to be administered yet. We're still waiting, especially with the pandemic. So it's hard to say where we're going to be at in about 6 weeks. But last year we were all virtual. So I'll talk a little bit about that shortly as well. We operate Monday through Friday, 8 to 3. We now have 6 immersion teaching staff. When we started in our first year, I was the only instructional staff. The second year, we were able to hire another one with grant funding. And this last year, we were very fortunate to receive the Esther Martinez Immersion ANA grant in our community, and we were able to hire some more instructional staff. We also have a trainee. We do have, this last year is the first year we were able to hire a administrative person. So that's been very helpful for me just because I've had to do that in the past. And we also have a curriculum consultant that works on some larger curriculum projects for the program. So we are expanding every year. As I mentioned, we're starting to expand our program. Our expansion plan, I guess that's what we're working on now. So we're adding our next classroom next school year. But we currently serve students ages 3 to 6. So the Language Nest classroom is a pre-K K classroom. Next year, we're doing a little bit of a switch, and then the year after, it'll be switched again, just to grade levels. We just needed to even out our numbers next year. But my classroom, I work in the Nest, so that's the youngest classroom. It's 3 to 4 to 5-year-old students. It's a pre-K, K combined classroom. We have 23 students enrolled right now. Students receive 40 hours of immersion instruction per week when we're in person. This last year was a lot different for us, but when we are in person, it's pretty much a full-time instruction. So we are in the process, as part of our expansion plan, we are working on developing curriculum and assessments for our program. So that is always a work in progress. It's never set in stone. Just like our languages, just like our people, we adapt to meet the needs of our community. And the same thing with our programming. We're always changing and adapting and figuring out what works best for us. So that's one thing I would offer to those that are working in other communities, that this work is evolving always. And so our curriculum is culturally centered. We use culturally centered content. We use our ceremonial cycle, the 13, we call them, it's Asanyawale, Yunkisota, Niwa Nihta Lord. It's like the 13 grandmother moons. It's our ceremonial cycle, and that's essentially our curriculum. So within that is our creation story, our opening and closing acknowledgments that we do before anything important. There's interwoven aspects within that, but essentially that entire content, our cultural content, that is basically our curriculum. So we're in the process of kind of documenting that, writing it down, so that we can use it to share it with others, especially our relative communities in the other Haudenosaunee nations out east. We do work with them, where Oneida language is, I would say, fairly close. Oneida is distinct from Mohawk, but they're related languages. So they're set up similarly, as well as the other nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. So we work with these other nations out east in our homelands to develop our programming, to develop our content, but also to develop our language. So that's kind of another area that we've been working with, is just developing curriculum, I guess you could say, as well as the assessments. That's always a work in progress. We have some proficiency assessments in place for students. We've researched and adapted them for our community here. We do teaching assessments for our staff. It measures their language development and teaching skills. We've adapted that from a Hawaiian teaching assessment that we've seen them use in their schools. Our students' assessments currently just measure proficiency, but we're hoping to just, now that we're expanding, measure their comprehension, their knowledge of the content that we're discussing in the classroom, as well as their proficiency. So that's kind of like the natural progression, I guess. And then we also do have some assessments for parents. They're very, I guess they're pretty simple, I guess, for the most part, but there's different things. We offer parent classes so parents can learn and use language in the home to support their students. And so the assessments that we have for parents are to engage them in using the language, establishing a value for the language. So it's a little bit different than the teaching and the student assessments, which are more on proficiency. The parent ones are kind of more of an initial step of establishing a value for the language and usage. So a few more things about our program, some of our program outcomes to date. You can see some pictures here. These are my high school students. We have, so our program I mentioned is it's administered out of the language department, which is a part of the United Nations school system. My program is physically located in the high school, which is a unique thing, but we love it. We have little children right next to high school classes, and we have a high school partnership. So the high school offers a independent study type of course where they offer credit for students to work in the immersion program. And then they also do a class with me once a week to develop their speaking skills and things they can learn how to say in the classroom. Because the girls, they also only use Oneida in the classroom. So it's really unique. It's one unique part of, I guess, our programming efforts is the partnership we have with the high school, physically being located in the high school, but also working with high school students and having them work as like helpers and interns in the classroom. So one of the really cool things we've seen that's come out of that is not only on our end with the kids, they have role models, younger youth role models to look up to, but the high school students and just working with the principal of the high school, him sharing that the high school students that work in the classroom, they've had better academic achievement, accountability to their academics, behavior, serving as leaders and role models within the school and the community. So we've seen a lot of really positive things come out about that, having our space located in the high school, but also having that partnership. So it's a really unique aspect that I just love that we work with in our program. So some of the girls you can see in the pictures, those are our high school helpers. So I think all three of them are graduated now. These were from 2 years ago, but she was the youngest, the one at the bottom. So she just graduated this last year. Now this one, she was with us our first year. Her name is Yaley. She's actually now a teacher trainee. So it's really unique because we're starting to see that the high school students that we've been working with are now kind of potential teachers. So it's a unique area because getting teachers for immersion education is a tricky task sometimes, but giving that exposure at a young age and just helping to be a guide and a mentor to our youth in our community it gives them more opportunities. And so we work closely still with all of our students. This one here, she's actually currently a summer youth intern with us through a different program. So it's really unique, I guess. That's one unique aspect about our program. But a few other things too, we have seen increased staff and student comprehension and proficiency. Externally, we've seen increased awareness within the community about the state of our language, increased support for immersion efforts, language revitalization in general, for our language in our community, and increased language use in our community. So, and even if that's just a few words, simple words like hello, sigali, or onagiwa, goodbye, just the usage of that's a really big thing. That's an initial step. So we're starting to see that within our community. And we see that even with people that whenever we go anywhere with the kids, them using the language with the kids because they know that that's the immersion group. So it's so unique to see that. It's such a really good like relationship building type of initiative. And it's really helping to just boost that language growth in our community. So I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the challenges that we've had as well in our community with our language programming. And I would say that these are as well, and I talk a lot about the language efforts in our community, but those definitely are some of, I guess, I am part of that. And so those are some of my challenges as well, being being an instructor in the program. So, but at this last year and a half, the pandemic has definitely been probably the biggest challenge that we've had thus far. Without the pandemic, we've already had a number of challenges. So this was one I would have never anticipated this, but it. What I do say is that working in language, you have just, I guess, a level of resiliency and problem-solving skills and energy to come up with creative solutions. So although it wasn't ideal, we definitely were able to adjust some of our efforts to meet the needs of our program and our students, but also, work within the pandemic. So we used a virtual platform this last year. We had to make some changes. It really was an experiment this last year. We did home visits at the beginning of last school year with students one-on-one, where the staff would go to the student's home and we would do a small 30-minute lesson outside, socially distanced with our kids in an immersion setting. We also did Facebook Live language lessons. So we would do circle time and a mealtime activity every day, 5 days a week. And we also did some Zoom one-on-one classes with students. So I don't know if we still have found the right thing that works virtually. It definitely is a struggle in itself. But I will say that the use of our Facebook Live lessons, we ended up using that because it was the easiest for the teaching staff to do, to record and administer. It was also very similar to teaching in immersion because Facebook Live is live. And so that's how it is literally in the classroom. So in order for us to keep up our skills as instructors, the live aspect was very helpful for us. And it was so easy because it's like one click button and share. And that was the other part of it too, sharing it. Our Facebook page, it was for our students, but it was accessible by anyone in the community. So that's why we ended up doing that, because other people were able to watch it beyond our students, our greater community. They could watch it or rewatch it anytime on our newsfeed. So they didn't have to watch it live because they could go back at any part of the day to watch the videos. So it was more accessible and it catered to the different schedules and the craziness of this last year. So that's what worked for us. It helped our students to develop comprehension because we try to just have engaging aspects of our lessons, but also still establish a routine and help them to at least have a baseline level of knowledge. So kind of to prepare them for when we are in person so that they have their ears, I guess, attuned to our words, and learning as well. So we did get parent feedback from that, and parents had said that the students were responding and learning words based on those lessons. So it was a unique challenge, but it was fun. I will say it was, I guess, for me as an instructor, it was probably one of the most challenging things I've ever had to do as a teacher. But we are resilient people as Indigenous people already. And I think it also did make me a better teacher. So as much as I don't know if I want to admit that yet, but it really did, I guess, enhance my skills. I had to learn a lot more words in Ongehoekne that I've never had to use before and make up a lot more new words to even say something about Facebook. So that was a unique aspect of this last year. So it was definitely a challenge, and there was definitely pros and cons, but and I'm not sure exactly how this next school year is going to be for us, but we'll just roll with it. That's what I always say with language learning. You learn how to ride the wave. That's how it is. Sometimes it's high tide, and sometimes it's low. And so language learning, language teaching, you just learn how to ride the wave, and you kind of are open and flexible to the changes of what's going on in the community or with the language or students or your classroom and whatnot. So, but the other thing too is, sometimes when it is like high tide or it's harder, one thing that's helped me personally to get through challenges is I always say, you let it roll off your back, like a duck. You just let the water roll off your back. And so that's one of the things too. You just take things with a grain of salt. And as personal as the work is, it is important to know that to not take it personally, which is a challenge because we are all human, but that, our heart is in it, and everyone's heart is in the place where we're all doing this together. We have a shared vision. So that is things to help keep in mind. And that's what has helped me personally through those challenges. Another challenge we had is funding. So that is always a challenge. I imagine it's probably a challenge for a lot of other communities as well. Currently, our entire Language Nest immersion program is solely grant funded. So we are working on getting the tribal organization to fund a percentage of our program. We really want to secure sustainable funding, hopefully create an endowment to support our program in the future. That is one of the biggest, I guess, for me as a head teacher, kind of a liaison to the administrators, is how are we going to pay our personnel, and how are we going to be able to do this? That's just a contemporary reality that we have. It's what makes our society flow, I guess. And so funding is a really real challenge we have in our community. But there are ways to still do things even without funding, which is how we started actually our Language Nest. Prior to the first formal year, it was actually a community run Language Nest out of our cookhouse, out of our longhouse in our community, that operated with a few teacher volunteers voluntarily prior to our first formal year. And so a lot of those teachers work also in the program now, and we've all worked together for many years in language learning, so we all know each other. And the students that were in that initial group are still in our program now. So it definitely is very grassroots. It starts very grassroots, and with the acquisition of more funding or grants, it's a little bit easier to be a little bit more formal, I guess, with it, or transition into some of those more formal aspects of educational program. Another challenge we've had is just teacher training. Teaching or training instructors in an immersion setting is, I guess, a little bit beyond maybe more of a regular, mainstream or white stream educational teacher, because we are teaching in only our language. So there is a very high level of proficiency that is required. We also have to have training in cultural skill development for teachers. We don't know everything about our own practices, so we have to bring in other people to teach us about that, so we can do it with students. Just teaching in general, teaching skills, having our students develop teaching skills. That's a really important aspect of our program. Understanding what immersion teaching techniques are, how to work with students, classroom management, communicating with parents. Those are a lot of the things that I work with teachers on, of how to do that. And so that is, I guess, it might be a challenge, but it's nothing I'm never really too worried about. Getting people to be teachers, sometimes that is an initial struggle, just because, sometimes it's not for everyone, and that's totally okay. It's just a part of, it's more than a job. It's like a community responsibility. And so there's so much more that's involved in being an immersion instructor, I suppose, in your community. And just having a willingness to learn and a value for the language is usually the initial I would say, requirement to getting a teacher, because language can be developed, teaching skills can be developed, but it's really if you have the value and see the importance for a language and want to do this work. That's that desire, I guess you could say. So another challenge too, and I kind of talked about this throughout the presentation, is immersion stereotypes or language learning stereotypes. What if my child is behind, their English development is not where it should be, which we know that those are not true, but change is sometimes that it's part of change. It's part of changing the language landscape in your community. And because our community hasn't had a formal immersion program, we don't know how, it is. And I'm very much learning in this process as well. So our community is learning as well. And so it's kind of a perspective shift, I guess you could say, in the community. But I use a lot of the research that I've done within my studies as a doctoral student to support and share and just build community awareness about this. But really, at the end of the day, it's about our language. We don't have spaces in our community where our language is heard or it lives or it's spoken. And that's what makes us Ungwahu, is that aspect of our identity or who we are. So that's what it always comes down to at the end of the day. So that's one thing that's kind of always ongoing as well. I didn't have it on here, but just educational policy in general, being inclusive or non-inclusive, I guess you could say, to Indigenous immersion as like a valid form of education or equitable form of education. So, but I've, prior to working in an immersion program, I worked in a public school. So I've been fortunate enough to develop relationships with people in the state and kind of foster some more inclusiveness within the Department of Public Instruction here in Wisconsin. So that's been, I guess, part of my job as well. But I just have a few more things here that I wanted to share. So just some teaching tools and techniques. And depending on the programming that you might have in your community, there's different levels to it. This is what we've used here. And so maybe it might be of use for you, or you might get something that you can bring back, to your community from here. But in our immersion program, staying in the language is key. It's using the resources around you to help you do that. It's coming up with creative ways to communicate, maybe with a teacher if you're not sure on a word, or things like that. What we've done is to make sure we always stay in the language. If I really have to say something to the teacher, I might text her. I'll write it on a Post-it note and give it to her. So there's like other ways of, being able to communicate, but to ensure that you're still staying in the language in the classroom. But in regards to teaching techniques, I guess for me, what I always call them is the big two, which have more than two things on there, but two topics, I guess you could say. Pictures, graphics, and drawings. Visuals are key to immersion. In our classroom, that's really helped us to explain words with a visual reference for students, as well as actions and body movements. So sometimes those things are paired together, sometimes they're not. So like, for example, talking to a student about, do you need to go to the bathroom? Asking them if they need to go to the bathroom. So if I said Islagan, you probably wouldn't know what that means if you were in an immersion setting. But if I had a picture of a bathroom and maybe a student going to there, they would say, oh, okay, they're developing, the comprehension about what that means. But if I don't have a picture handy, I might do like, maybe the potty dance or something like that, or some type of gesture or body movement to support my speech. To help them develop that comprehension, and as well as show them that showing or demonstrating to them, that's really important too, because then they can see, oh, okay, this is what she means. And sometimes it doesn't happen right away, and that is okay. It develops over time. So it's repetition and routine that's also key to immersion. But I just added a few other things on here too. So gestures and facial expressions, especially, if you're talking about emotions, or if I said Saguli, and if you might not know what that means, but if I said Saguli, just using an expression like that, you're like, oh, that probably means hello. So you're developing that comprehension with that support. Context and activities, that is very helpful for teaching as well. You learn by doing. So a good one is mealtime. Students develop a lot of a strong comprehension about those words that are used during that time because it's mealtime. They understand we can talk about foods, we can talk about the words or verbs of eating, drinking, things like that. So that's kind of another helpful thing is doing that activity. Students will develop a comprehension in that. And just some other helpful aspects, repetition and routine, it's central to immersion. That's going to help develop that comprehension for students. Patience and persistence is also very key to this work, I guess you could say. Sometimes it doesn't happen right away. We kind of live in a instant gratification society. So if it doesn't happen right away, we're like, oh, it doesn't work. Not true. It takes some persistence in immersion. And it might happen right away. That's great. And it might not. And that's also okay. But eventually it does happen. And then always holding that belief with you that you know that it will happen for students, and it will. That's one thing I always carry with me as a teacher is I always want the best for my students. So, and if I didn't, I said, oh, they can't do that. They're probably not going to do that. But if I believe that they can do that, they will do that. So it's our cultural value of a good mind. That's how we practice that in action. Less is more. Simplicity is really key in immersion too. Sometimes just teaching or education in general, we want lots of fancy things in the classroom and in the wall, but really at the end of the day, simple is best. They can develop a foundational framework of comprehension in our language. It actually boosts creativity for them too. So that's really helpful. Planning is really critical in immersion as well. I just did a training, Indigenous Montessori training. I've been doing it for the last 2 months with this group out of, I think, Arizona or New Mexico. And they've stressed the same thing. Planning is key. Just flying, she said, flying by the seat of your pants is not recommended, which I would agree with, just because it really takes some intentionality and planning and prep on the instructor end to be intentional about what students are learning. In some of the work we do here too, it kind of requires a high level of energy, I guess you could say. You can probably tell by my demeanor. So, but in a positive outlook, that really makes all the difference. Just having this growth mindset and practicing that anything is possible, and that even the hardest things that we can't find solutions for, we can find solutions for, and that we have the ability to do that. So that's one of the other things I would say too. Language development is continuous. It is a lifelong journey. I will not know everything tomorrow. I will learn it throughout the course of my life. And I would say the same thing for anyone. It takes your entire life. And so if you're able to remind yourself of that, that really helps too. As a teacher, I always have to continuously practice my own language development. And then the last thing too, I would say, is just practicing critical reflection. Sometimes lessons don't work out the way you plan. A lot of times they don't, and that's okay, because we learn a lot from that. Embracing mistakes is really important to this work. Being okay or being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that's also okay too. That's kind of a part of this work, I guess you would say. And then the last thing is just remembering your why. If you do this work or whatever work you do within your community, thinking about what is your personal why, what are your personal motivators, what is your why as a community. What I always tell people is identify it, write it down. It'll manifest itself. It'll serve as a reminder for you, and carry that with you, keep it with you. And it might change over time, and that's okay. Because a lot of times this work, it does change, and it's transformational too. It affects who we are as individuals and our personality and our outlook on life, and that's all for the good. And the other thing I always say is, sometimes people will ask me, oh, that must be such hard work. I said, no, this is heart work. It comes from within. And so if you think about it like that, it really just, it serves as something you can carry with you. Sometimes, when it's, high tide or you're riding the waves. But really, it's really important to just be kind and loving, to yourself in the process of teaching and learning your Indigenous language. Embrace mistakes. We learn through mistakes. Perfectionism is a characteristic of white supremacy culture. And as Indigenous people, we want to push back on that because that is not part of our ways. We want to really embrace learning by doing, embracing mistakes, and using those as learning tools for our, continued development. Collaborating with others, other people in your community, other people in related communities. And don't forget to smile and laugh. I always say, they say laughter is medicine. It really is. Even if you make a mistake, you just laugh it off. And it makes things easier, I'll say. And in our classroom, once our students develop like a level of comprehension, as a staff, we're second language learners. And so sometimes our brains naturally will say, process English up here. But the students, and sometimes what comes out maybe is the wrong word, students will correct us. But it is refreshing, and it's funny because they really are sharp. Their little brains, just being as young as they are, sharp. They're sponges at such a young age. So it's important to keep that with you. Just smile and laugh and embrace those mistakes. So I just, as always, this is what I keep with me all the time is Agijokwa, my students, my group, my kids, this is our why. We're Oneida, and this is why we do what we do. So I think that went longer than I anticipated, so my apologies. But that is pretty much what I wanted to share with you guys today. So Yawanko for allowing me the opportunity to do that.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Rosa, for that incredibly inspiring and thorough presentation. We're now ready to start our Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. So our first question is from Robert Cruz, and he asks about the core content in curriculum. Are there strategies to help children develop core values, such as taboos, behavior patterns to prepare them for their future in adolescent years? In effect, the way to behave in family environments and to understand their relationship to the fauna and flora, lessons that animals provide for students to know how to behave. Are there strategies to make up new words?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. First, Yanko for the question. We do have some strategies to help students develop, I guess, understanding of our common core cultural values. One thing about, I guess, our culture here is that because our language is very action oriented, we support that and use that as one of the mechanisms for teaching students about cultural values is practicing them. And that's what helps them to develop the comprehension of those things. We are in the process of really fine-tuning a lot of the aspects of the curriculum that you kind of mentioned in the question. So they're, I would say, very much in development for us. We right now use a lot of pictures and visuals to help students develop understanding of, I guess, good choices and behavior. So we have very young students, the classroom that I teach in, starting at age 3. So we try to incorporate and adjust a lot of what we teach to their current development, where they're at in their age, what they can do for themselves, and what is appropriate for that current age group or development, for like childhood development. So for 3-year-olds, it really sometimes is just getting them to have an understanding initially about, making good choices, sharing, some of those basic needs first. So what our plan is to kind of establish that and then start to incorporate and use those as a basis for really supporting our cultural values, like a good mind. What is the practice of a good mind look like? Well, it might be being a good friend, sharing with another student. Those are things that would be, I guess, appropriate for an age, a group 3 to 5, I suppose you could say. And so we are, as students get older, we're going to, I guess, deepen the content to really have them focus on, those relationships they have to creation, and those relationships they have to animals, how to behave in terms of their relationships to creation. So I guess I would say it's a building block process. We establish that right now through we do the opening and closing, the Ganahela Donsel or the Ohandugali Wadekwa is like for our communities, like the opening address, or sometimes they'll call it like the Thanksgiving address. And so they're developing that identification initially, and then we identify or establish what their relationships are to those things. So hopefully that answered your question.
Robert Cruz also asked, are there strategies to make up new words?
Yeah. What we do a lot for our community is direct translations, at least for our language, sometimes are more difficult. What I always go back to and what I tell the teaching staff is, or our teaching staff for our program is, what is like the intention either behind the word or the phrase? What are the characteristics of it? Like maybe what it looks like, how would we describe that? What is like essentially the meaning of it? So, just to say like, maybe like a chair, if I was to translate that in Oneida. So obviously direct translation, what really is a chair? It's something you sit on. So that might be how we would make up the word for a chair in our language. So it's always like, what does it do? What is its purpose? What is that meaning? And that's what helps us. That's kind of the strategy we use to make up new words. Just one of my personal philosophies is that our languages are so detailed, they are highly advanced, and we can make up a word for anything in our language. So that sometimes I guess that's just what I've seen sometimes, like in other language learning environments, the reverting back to English because we don't have a word in our language. That's one thing I don't believe in, just because I always feel we can make a word up in our language for that. And what that does, one of the reasons why I do that is because just my personal belief is that our English dominant society, it holds a lot of power, and our languages are always suppressed under English. And so if we can literally uphold our language, either as an equal or equitable measure to English, our languages, what we're doing is asserting our tribal sovereignty. We are reaffirming that our language is valuable and knowledgeable, and that we have all that we need within our words, within our language to make up new words. The other one we were just talking about, sorry if you can hear my dog in the background, but the other one we were just talking about this last week was plastic. So I was asking around in our department, have you heard a word for plastic? So usually what I'll do is I'll check with other people, because sometimes others have heard words. And if not, then that's when I start, okay, well, I'll make up a word for this. What really is plastic? So even the word for Facebook, we've made up words for that. So we've come up with a lot of contemporary Oneida words for the current era that we live in, just because, things like printer, laptop, phone, TV, we didn't have those words, but we've made up words to just meet the needs of our people and our society. And so reverting back to English, that's one thing it's more than just not having a word in the language. It's really asserting your language as something that still can be used. It's not suppressing it under English, but it is valuable. And so that's sometimes that's one of the things I guess that I always like carry with me. I'm like, we have a word, we can make a word, and our language is important and it's valuable. And it's easy to revert to English. It is, what's the word? English, I don't know. I'm not trying to sound like I'm knocking on English. It's pretty simple. That's what I would say. It's a very simple language. In our Indigenous languages, they are so detailed. We just have such a beautiful view and a beautiful definition of what something is from one word. It's so detailed. So that's just a reflection of our culture. Our people are highly intelligent and intellectual people. And if we use our language, we can continue to model that even in the current society. So
we have another question from Leslie Harper, who says, inspiring work you folks are doing. And the question is, in today's learning challenges, outside of Oneida Nation endowment, what tangible support solution do your folks need that outsiders can provide? What would you like to see created, implemented to fully support your vision?
Let's see. Funding and policy would be my two really brief answers in a nutshell, I guess. I guess for me, funding is such a, I guess there's so many aspects to that, but I guess I would like to see more direct funding from the state and the federal government without provisions attached, I guess you could say. Even grant funding, we got to work for that, and then we got to report on it. And it just creates so many barriers. For Indigenous people, I'm fortunate in our community, we have a pretty organized organizational structure, but I know a lot of other communities don't have that. They don't have the infrastructure to apply for highly competitive A&A grants. And so just that alone, an A&A grant, it is inaccessible for a lot of communities. And so that's one thing I would say is just beyond my community here, because we are fortunate to do that. I know that so many other Native communities are so much smaller and they don't have that. And so that it just is such a barrier already to just have funding for language, So I just want to see free, no provisions attached types of fundings just allocated already to communities for language programming from the state, from the federal government. And I would say that those, I think, are part of their treaty obligations, I would say too, because we know that our languages have been highly affected by, everything that's happened in American history. And so I feel like this, I guess, is part of their responsibility to our communities to, right some of those wrongs, especially in the light of what's coming out now with the boarding schools. How are we going to, I guess, how is the United States, I suppose you could say, or individual states going to, resolve or make right some of those things that have been done to us? And I would say that because those were direct attacks on our language and culture, that they should now be allocating or reallocating federal and state funding towards languages, all languages of every community in the United States and throughout Canada, without provisions, without reporting. It just makes our job so much harder. And I know it's part of it too. This is kind of what we have to do right now, but that's what I would like to see, I guess I would say, as well as policy inclusion. There are just so many stigmas. Sometimes it feels like with immersion in our own community, but externally too, in the state of Wisconsin, where I'm from, in the United States in general. There's just, sometimes an attitude that, immersion is that, well, that's not what we do. And that's not, important or valuable, or, students, there's some stigma that students aren't receiving a high quality education in immersion, which we know is not true, because we're comparing it to white stream education, which we know also isn't working either. So it's just such a unique attitude, I guess, that we see in education right now. And I don't know exactly the right way to address or how inclusive policy might be created in the state or the United States, but I would say that every tribe can probably contribute to a good solution for that, and that the states and the United States should look to the tribes to figure out what that is, and just really respect tribal sovereignty, because I know a lot of times it's one of those words we say, what we talk about, okay, we're going to assert our tribal sovereignty, we're going to do this, but tribal sovereignty, it has many facets, and our education and our language is very much a part of that. And administering our own forms of education, and that includes immersion and getting the respect and I guess the respect that it deserves. So sorry, that was long-winded. Sorry.
Yeah, you're just so thorough, and we just are loving everything you're saying. But we've got a lot of really interesting questions. So this one's from Whitney Nephew. What's the minimum level of language proficiency among second language speakers that you would consider for hire as a classroom teacher?
We have in our community with the language department, we have the language department has developed a number of curriculums, sequential curriculums that help develop proficiency in a second language learner. So what we require for our program is that applicants pass a number of those curriculum oral assessments that the language department administers in order to be, I guess, qualified to apply for a position like this. So essentially, teachers already come in with a high level of proficiency, hired teachers. We do have positions in our program where we also hire trainees. The trainees do not have to have any experience in language. The only thing that is required for them is to have a value of the language and culture and a desire to want to teach. We will teach them everything else, but those are kind of like baseline things. And we've learned that over time. That was just one of our growing pains and our learning experiences, is that we noticed that if we have teachers that don't value our language or our culture and they don't want to teach, it is not going to make our efforts successful. We really need people that have a shared vision on this, and we can teach them language and teaching techniques along the way. It really starts with like a core appreciation of Ongohoitne. So the trainees they don't need to have any language experience, like zero. They usually are in trainee phase for like 1 to 2 years at least. The teachers generally start out as trainees, and they are already in trainee phase for a few years, and then we'll hire them on as actual teachers. So that's it's starting to develop. It's only been like that for the last 2-3 years now. I was hired as the initial teacher. I actually taught Oneida language as a second language in a public school for about 5 years. So I had developed it a little differently, my own proficiency, but it still fit with the job. And so it was essentially what a trainee does. I just did it in a different environment. I've also worked and learned with the language house for a while. Basically that level of proficiency that the teachers have, they have to have an understanding of how verbs are conjugated in our language. They have to have an understanding about what we call stems in our language. They are pronoun patterning systems. We have 8 stems that have 2 sides. We call them a subjective and objective. They have to have an understanding about all the pronoun changes per stem, which is essentially a verb category. So it seems like a lot, but it's really all based on the same pattern. They do have to have an understanding of nouns, the counting system, some basic readings. That's what the language department curriculum assesses. And so if they pass that assessment, it's always an oral assessment. They just say it. So there's no reading or writing. It's all oral, which is kind of catered to how our language is obviously taught and learned. It was traditionally done orally, so we've kept it like that. But that's
a good question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what is this is also from Whitney Nephew. What is your year-round schedule for students, and how do you handle the risk of student language regression at breaks?
Mhm. We have been growing and changing the last every single year of our program. I would still say we're a new program. This will be our 4th year now, but because we're expanding into a school, it's we're always facing new challenges. So this year is actually the first year we are going to implement a year-round schedule. That's what we wanted to do since year one. It just wasn't as feasible at the time. Some things like food service and busing kind of dictate that. So that's always the struggle and balancing, those challenges. Prior to that, it was during a regular school year, so September to May or September to June. For me, I was never really worried about language regression. I think it's just the practice of a good mind. Because sometimes for me, just personally, if I let fear creep in and I let that foster and manifest in how I see this work, then it's going to happen. So I try not to let that enter that practice, my teaching practice. And I always say my students, they will retain this. And I align my actions with that too. And I'm a part of the community, so I see the students all the time. And I always make it an effort, even outside of the classroom, to only use Oneida with them. And just that it's just waking their brains up, I guess, again. It's always there. That's how I feel. It's always there. And maybe it's just asleep for a little bit for the summer, and then it wakes up again. But the second year we had the program, we had summer break, and it was something I thought about, and I wasn't sure how it was going to be. When the students got back, or returning students, it only took them about 3 days to get back into routine and just redevelop that level of comprehension they had at the end of the previous school year. So it was okay for the most part. This last year, I guess that is a little bit more in the front of my mind, thinking about language regression, especially in terms of COVID. We've been doing virtual programming, but we haven't done in person, and it hasn't been all day. It's been very scaled back this last year. So I still believe that it is going to be okay. I am anxious to know how this next school year is going to be and how we're going to administer the program. It's still up in the air right now, probably for the next few weeks, but I think it'll be okay. I just try to keep a really positive outlook about where I see my students' proficiency being developed. And that has, I guess, helped and transferred to where they're at with their proficiency. But we've had more experience as teachers as well, and our skills have developed. So that has really helped kind of lessen this notion of language regression, just because we've gotten better at teaching. So those things kind of, I guess, work hand in hand.
We're running out of time, Rosa, and we have so many fantastic questions. Thank you, everyone. We're only going to be able to do one more. And Mark Paulus asks, are you able to utilize multi-age grade learning spaces within the lower grades?
Yes, we do have all of our classrooms are they are multi-grade and will continue to be multi-grade, just because we like that aspect of intergenerational learning, pairing older and younger students. The idea of compartmentalization in grades is kind of a characteristic of white stream education, and we have a lot to learn with each other, which is and from each other. So that's kind of why we have the high school partnership, and then we also have the multi-age level grades in the classrooms. It also helps with staffing too, because we really want to pair 2 teachers in every class. It may change in the future, but it's up in the air right now. But it demonstrates conversation to students. It just is helpful to have a second teacher in there. But the multi-age, multi-grade level learning spaces, it really is about that intergenerational learning, I guess you would say. And having older students help younger students, that really strengthens what they know. When you're able to teach something that you know, it just sharpens your skills more so, I guess you would say. And it's kind of our work, I would say, is definitely like a pushback on white stream education, because we are different. We do have a lot of cross-cultural things that we definitely utilize in the program. We have a very contemporary classroom space and whatnot, but just the way in which we do things, I would say, is unique. And I guess my hope is that programming, Indigenous language immersion programming in various communities can be like a model maybe for white stream education, and just help, schools and, other learning programs in our society to be more inclusive to some of our values that we have as Indigenous people. So,
well, thank you, Rosa. And I want to thank everybody on the Q&A for submitting such fantastic questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all, but we hope you'll join us at our next ILI Symposium webinar. And thank you, Rosa. It's just been a fantastic presentation, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
yes.
Thank you.